So imagine you're playing a game of telephone, right? But this game lasts for 1,000 years.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a terrible game.
Yeah, exactly. You whisper this highly detailed story to a friend in, say, 100 BC.
Right.
And the person at the very end of the line doesn't repeat that story out loud until 900 AD.
The message would be completely ruined by then.
Right. Logic dictates that the final message would be totally unrecognizable. The signal degrades, details just vanish.
Yeah, a story about a fisherman ends up being, I don't know, a story about a flying chariot or something.
Exactly. And that is the natural, completely understandable assumption that most of us make when we think about ancient texts. I mean, if human communication gets totally distorted across a single room in 5 minutes, what does a millennium of manual copying do to a document?
Massive question.
It is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at this massive stack of historical, manuscript, and archaeological data to see if the ancient texts of the Bible actually survived this ultimate millennium-long game of telephone.
And, we're doing this by taking faith completely out of the equation.
Right. Which is important to clarify.
Exactly. This isn't a discussion about theology or, belief in the unseen. We are evaluating this strictly through the lens of hard, objective manuscript evidence.
Just the raw data.
Just the data. By the end of this deep dive, you will understand the precise scientific and historical rulers that secular historians use to evaluate any piece of ancient literature. We're going to take the exact same standards used to measure classical Greek and Roman history, and we're going to apply them directly to the biblical text.
Well, let's start with those rulers then, because if we're going to figure out if the telephone game ruined a text, we first need to know how historians actually score the game.
Yeah, makes sense.
When an archaeologist pulls a crumbling piece of parchment out of the dirt, what are the objective metrics they use to decide if the words on it are actually reliable?
So, textual critics use 3 very specific standards to evaluate the transmission of an ancient document.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is the date of original composition. So, when did the author actually put pen to paper?
Right, the starting line.
Exactly. Second is the time gap. This is that chronological dark age between the original composition and the very earliest surviving copy that we can physically analyze today.
Okay, so the length of the telephone game.
You got it. And third is manuscript quantity. Simply put, what's our sample size? How many surviving handwritten copies exist in the total historical record?
Date, time gap, and quantity. So basically, the smaller the time gap and the larger the quantity of copies, the higher the score.
Precisely. A short time gap means there was, very little time for myths to develop or for the original message to be intentionally altered before copies were made.
That makes total sense.
And a massive quantity of manuscripts just means historians have a large enough data set to cross-reference and spot any errors.
Okay, before we look at the biblical texts, I feel like we need a baseline. Put this into perspective for us. Let's look at the heavyweights of classical antiquity. Texts that no modern scholar in any university on earth ever really questions as being historically authentic.
Okay, let's run the numbers.
Yeah. How do the foundational documents of Western civilization score on this test?
We will start with Julius Caesar and his famous historical account, the Gallic Wars.
Oh, a classic.
Right. So it was written right around the 1st century BC. Our absolute earliest surviving manuscript copy dates to 900 AD.
Wait, 900 AD?
Yes, meaning historians are working across a chronological time gap of roughly 1,000 years.
Wow.
And as for the quantity, we have a total of 10 surviving manuscript copies.
Hang on. We base our entire historical understanding of Caesar's wars in Gaul on 10 copies that were written 1,000 years after he lived.
We do. And it is universally accepted as historically reliable.
That is wild. Okay, what about Plato?
Let's look at Plato. He wrote between 427 and 347 BC. The earliest copy we have is also from 900 AD.
So that's
a 1,200-year gap.
A 1,200-year gap. And how many surviving copies?
7.
7 copies. And a 1,200-year blind spot. That's just crazy to me.
It really puts things in perspective. Now, Aristotle gives us slightly better data.
Yeah.
Written in the 4th century BC. The earliest physical copy is from 1000 AD. So we are looking at a 1,400-year gap.
Which is even worse.
It is, but we do have 49 surviving manuscripts to cross-reference.
Okay, so Aristotle has a better sample size with 49, but a 1,400-year dark age. I mean, that is an unimaginably long time for a text to be subjected to the telephone game.
It really is.
What is the gold standard then? What is the best-case scenario from the ancient world?
Historically, that would be Homer's Iliad.
Okay.
Written around 900 BC.
Yeah.
The earliest physical copy dates to 400 BC, so the time gap shrinks dramatically to just 500 years.
Okay, much better.
And the quantity is staggering for the ancient world, 643 surviving copies.
A 500-year gap and 643 copies. I can see why historians love that. I mean, you can easily compare 643 copies against each other to weed out spelling mistakes or, rogue edits. All right, so now that we have the baseline for classical history, let's drop the New Testament data into the equation. How does it hold up?
So the books of the New Testament were originally written between 40 and 100 AD.
Okay.
The earliest fragment we possess today, it's this piece of papyrus containing verses from the Gospel of John dates to roughly 125 AD.
Let me stop you right there. 125 AD.
Yeah.
So if the Gospel of John was finished near the end of the 1st century, you are talking about a time gap of only 25 to 50 years.
It is essentially a single generation.
That's nothing.
It's incredible. Compare that 25 to 50-year gap to the 1,000-year gap for Julius Caesar, or the 1,200-year gap for Plato. There simply wasn't enough time for the telephone game to even begin, let alone for legendary corruption to completely replace the original history.
Right.
But the time gap isn't even the most startling data point. If Homer's Iliad is the classical gold standard at 643 manuscript copies,
Yeah.
the New Testament has over 24,000 manuscript copies.
Oh, 24,000 copies.
Over 24,000, yes.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because intuitively, that sounds like a massive problem.
How so?
Well, if you have 24,000 handwritten copies spreading across different continents, aren't you just, multiplying the chances for massive mutations? If 10 kids in a circle ruin a message, what do 24,000 scribes do? Doesn't more volume actually mean a messier game of telephone?
It's a great question, but you have to think about how textual criticism actually works. Having 24,000 manuscripts isn't a linear telephone game.
Okay.
It is much closer to a modern decentralized network or, a blockchain.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, these 24,000 copies weren't just made in one city by one group of people. They were copied in multiple ancient languages, Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, originating from entirely different geographically isolated parts of the ancient world.
Right. When you say Syriac and Coptic, you're talking about ancient Middle Eastern and Egyptian languages.
Exactly.
So these texts are separated by thousands of miles of desert and sea.
They are. So imagine a rogue scribe in Egypt decides to alter a verse to fit a specific local theology. Or maybe he just accidentally skips a line.
Sure. Human error.
Right. If we only had 10 manuscripts, that error might become part of the dominant text. But because we have a decentralized network of 24,000 manuscripts, historians immediately spot the anomaly.
Because the others don't have it.
Exactly. The thousands of copies from Greece, Rome, and Syria don't contain that Egyptian scribe's mistake. The sheer overwhelming volume acts as a self-correcting mechanism.
Wow.
The error is flagged and isolated, and the original text is reconstructed with incredible precision.
That completely flips the paradigm. The multitude of copies isn't a vulnerability, it's a security feature.
Yes.
Which leads to a really profound realization for anyone evaluating history. I mean, if a skeptical scholar accepts the histories of Caesar and Plato as absolute fact based on 7 copies and a 1,200-year gap,
they've painted themselves into a corner.
Yeah.
Textual scholars refer to this as the historical consistency rule. You cannot logically accept classical history without question, but then reject the New Testament, which possesses a fraction of the time gap and thousands of times more manuscript evidence.
it's just intellectually dishonest.
Right. To dismiss the biblical text while trusting Aristotle means you are simply not playing by the same scholarly rules. You're applying a hyper-skeptical yardstick to one specific text because of its religious implications, not because of its historical merits.
Well, that secures the New Testament. The evidence there is overwhelmingly robust. But that actually creates a massive elephant in the room.
Oh, the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly. The New Testament is the new part of the text. The Old Testament is centuries older.
Right.
That means a vastly longer timeline for the telephone game to wreak havoc. Did the math completely fall apart for the Hebrew scriptures?
For a very long time, critics believed it did. The timeline for the Old Testament presented a major historical hurdle. Before 1947, the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible we possessed was a document called the Masoretic Aleppo Codex.
And what exactly was the Aleppo Codex?
It was essentially the master authoritative copy of the Hebrew Bible, and it dated to 935 AD.
935 AD, which means it was written nearly 1,000 years after the final book of the Old Testament was officially recognized and completed.
Correct. We had a nearly 1,000-year gap of entirely manual pre-printing press copying.
Oh.
Skeptics reasonably looked at that millennium and argued that massive theological drifts, massive rewrites, and catastrophic copying errors were inevitable.
It's the Caesar problem all over again. 1,000 years of blind copying. So how did that assumption get shattered in 1947?
It was shattered by what many historians consider the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century.
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
Exactly. So a Bedouin shepherd boy was wandering the harsh terrain of the Judean desert. He tossed a stone into a high cave near the Dead Sea, expecting it to, just bounce off the limestone.
Right, just a kid throwing rocks.
Yeah. But instead, he heard the distinctive sound of shattering clay.
Oh, wow. A teenager throwing a rock completely upends a century of skeptical historical criticism.
The irony is incredible. That shattered jar led to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Archaeologists spent the next decade excavating 11 caves in the region of Qumran.
And what did they find?
They uncovered over 900 ancient manuscripts, and the critical detail is that these scrolls dated back to roughly 100 BC.
At 100 BC. So literally overnight, the timeline of manuscript evidence for the Old Testament was pushed back by 1,000 years.
Instantly.
The massive Dark Age gap was completely closed.
Completely closed, and they found fragments or complete copies of every single book in the Old Testament, with the exception of one.
Wait, which one was missing?
The Book of Esther, which is a fascinating archaeological quirk.
Really? Why?
Well, scholars believe these texts were meticulously copied and hidden by the Essenes. They were this incredibly strict monastic Jewish community living out in the desert. Esther is the only book in the Old Testament that never explicitly mentions the name of God, Yahweh. The working theory is that the Essenes, who were fanatically dedicated to the explicit worship of Yahweh, chose not to copy it for that specific reason.
That detail alone tells you so much about the intensity of the people doing the copying. But how exactly did they copy these texts? Because, if they just sat in a cave quickly transcribing scrolls by candlelight, mistakes would still happen.
Right, but the mechanism of ancient Jewish scribal practices is the exact opposite of hasty transcription. It was a severe, highly regulated science.
How severe?
Scribes were required to count every single letter and every single word on a parchment. If the total count of a newly copied scroll didn't match the master scroll exactly, the copy was considered profane.
They didn't just cross it out and fix it.
No, it wasn't corrected. It was buried in a grave called a geniza, or it was just destroyed.
That is dedicated.
They even had strict physical protocols, like wiping their pens or taking ritual baths before writing the name of God. They didn't just read and copy, they engineered a flawless transmission system.
Which sets up the ultimate historical stress test. In 1947, scholars finally had a 2,000-year-old scroll from the desert, and they had the Aleppo Codex from 1,000 years later.
Yes.
The critics had confidently claimed that a millennium of manual copying would result in a heavily mutated, unreliable text. So what happened when they actually laid the two documents side by side?
We could look at the exhaustive analysis done by Old Testament scholars, particularly examining the great Isaiah scroll found at Qumran. It is a massive, complete document.
Okay, what did they find?
When compared to the standard Hebrew Bible translated 1,000 years later, the 2,000-year-old scroll was word-for-word identical in more than 95% of the text.
95% identical.
Yeah.
Across 1,000 years of copying by hand in a desert. No spell check, no printing presses, just unbelievable human discipline. But what about that 5%? Skeptics might hear that and think, aha, that 5% is where they added all the miracles and changed the theology.
Not at all. That remaining 5% consisted entirely of minor spelling variations and obvious slips of the pen.
Just ancient typos.
Exactly. To use our earlier analogy, it's the decentralized consensus in action. The variations were the ancient equivalent of discovering a document that spells color with a U instead of without a U, or maybe a missing conjunction like the word and.
So it didn't change the meaning.
None of the 5% altered a single historical fact, doctrinal claim, or theological concept. The Dead Sea Scrolls conclusively proved that the text was essentially frozen in time.
So the words on the page absolutely survived the telephone game. But, establishing that a text was copied perfectly is only half the battle. I could meticulously copy a work of pure fiction for 1,000 years without a single typo. How do we know the history described in these perfectly preserved scrolls actually happened in the real world?
That requires stepping away from the manuscripts and looking into the dirt. Archaeology.
Right.
If an ancient text is historically accurate, the physical, geographical world should reflect its granular claims. And the physical artifacts pulled from the Middle East have repeatedly locked the biblical narrative to tangible history.
Let's talk about the Tel Dan inscription, because for a long time there was this whole school of minimalist archaeology that claimed King David was basically the Jewish King Arthur-like, a mythological hero with no historical footprint outside the Bible.
Yes, exactly. Until archaeologists uncovered the Tel Dan stele. It is a shattered stone monument erected by an Aramean king, an enemy of Israel.
Okay.
Etched into this non-biblical physical monument was a boast about a military victory over the House of David. It provided explicit, secular corroboration that David's dynasty was a real, historical entity that neighboring kingdoms recognized and fought against.
The rocks quite literally cried out.
They did.
And it wasn't just ancient kings. This applies to New Testament figures as well, right? Like the Pontius Pilate Stone.
Exactly. So Pontius Pilate is a central figure in the trial of Jesus. The text specifically titles him the prefect of Judea, the Roman governor in charge of the region.
Right.
For centuries, skeptics doubted his title, and some doubted his existence entirely, assuming he was a literary invention to frame the crucifixion narrative.
Until they dug something up.
Until 1961. Archaeologists were excavating a limestone block in Caesarea Maritima on the coast of Israel. Carved into the stone was an authentic first-century dedication to the Emperor Tiberius, authored by none other than Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
Wow.
The text matched the physical dirt perfectly.
So when you zoom out and look at all of this, the thousands of manuscripts, the decentralized cross-referencing, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the stones pulled from the dirt, it highlights a structural difference between the Bible and other major global religious texts.
It does.
And this is a strictly historical, analytical observation. If you compare the origin structure of the Bible to the Quran, to Buddhist texts, or to the Book of Mormon, what is the primary difference?
The fundamental structural difference is single-source origination versus multi-source origination.
Break that down for us.
Sure. Traditions like Islam, Buddhism, or Mormonism are fundamentally single-source. The Quran represents the revelations of one man, Muhammad, recorded by his followers. Buddhist traditions stem from the teachings of one figure. The Book of Mormon was produced by one man, Joseph Smith.
Right. One point of origin, one human perspective.
Exactly. The biblical texts present a massive logistical anomaly. It is not one book written by one founder. It is a library of 66 individual books. And those books were written by 40 different authors.
And these 40 authors weren't just sitting in a royal court together collaborating on a master narrative, right?
No, not at all. These authors were separated by a vast span of 1,500 years. They were spread across 3 different continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe.
That's a massive spread.
And they wrote in 3 distinct ancient languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. You have military generals, desert shepherds, fishermen, prime ministers, and captive exiles writing completely independent texts.
Yet, despite that extreme diversity of time, geography, and authorship, when you lay those 66 books side by side, they form one unified, structurally cohesive narrative centered on a single theme and a single person.
Yes.
I mean, the Old Testament authors predict the arrival of a Messiah, the New Testament authors record his life and resurrection, and the epistles unpack the meaning of it all. Coordinating a unified historical narrative across 1,500 years and 3 continents without it dissolving into contradictory chaos is just structurally unique in ancient literature.
It is a logistical impossibility without some form of unified oversight. And the contrast becomes even sharper when we evaluate the physical archaeological evidence for these different traditions.
Yeah, this is a point of comparison that really puts the physical evidence into perspective. Take the Book of Mormon, for example. The foundational claim of its origin rests on Joseph Smith translating ancient golden metallic plates in the 19th century.
Right.
Yet those metallic plates have never been found by any archaeologist. The historical record indicates they were taken away or lost.
Which presents a severe deficit in objective physical evidence.
Right. We cannot locate metallic plates from upstate New York from the 1800s, yet archaeologists have successfully found, excavated, and verified incredibly fragile leather and papyrus scrolls hidden in Middle Eastern caves that are over 2,100 years old.
It's pretty striking.
The sheer volume of tangible, touchable proof surrounding the biblical text is staggering.
When you connect to all this evidence, it helps explain why the text is endured. The Bible is objectively the most scrutinized, heavily researched, and intensely attacked piece of literature in human history.
Oh, without a doubt.
It has been targeted by Roman emperors who tried to burn every copy, critiqued by Enlightenment philosophers, banned by communist governments, and dissected by modern academics.
And yet it remains completely intact.
There is a brilliant quote from the late Billy Graham that perfectly summarizes this phenomenon. He said, "The Bible is the anvil that has worn out many hammers."
Oh, I love that.
Every single generation produces a new wave of skeptics who are absolutely certain they have finally found the argument, the flaw, or the philosophy that will break the text. But the anvil remains pristine, and the hammers just keep breaking.
The anvil that has worn out many hammers. What a striking visual to end on. We started this deep dive by asking if ancient texts were just victims of a massive historical game of telephone.
But we found the opposite.
We did. By applying the strict, objective rulers of historiography, we found something entirely different. The 25 to 50-year time gaps, the decentralized network of 24,000 manuscripts, the obsessive scribal precision of the Essenes, proving a 95% identical transmission over a millennium, the stones confirming kings and governors. I mean, it all points to a text guarded with unimaginable precision.
Its historical pedigree utterly dwarfs the most accepted classical histories of the world.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, provocative question. We have spent this time establishing the objective metrics of how the physical text survived. But what happens when you take that exact same rigorous standard and apply it to the actual claims the text makes about human nature, morality, and eternity?
It's the real challenge.
Right. If the historical timeline is secure, if the archaeology is verified, and the words haven't changed over thousands of years, how does that change the way you read its message tomorrow? If the vessel carrying the message survived the greatest empires and the sharpest minds in history completely unharmed, what does that say about the power of the message inside?
That is the ultimate question that historical evidence demands we answer.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, demand the data, and wherever the evidence leads, don't be afraid to follow it. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us on this hour on the Archive Hour. Join us on our next hour as we bring you more adventures from the Bible.